here is one of the strangest facts in all of European history. For more than 2,000 years, historians believed they knew where the Etruscans came from. The answer seemed settled. Ancient writers had already provided it. Case closed. The Etruscans, according to the famous Greek historian Herodotus, were migrants from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. A famine struck their homeland. Part of the population boarded ships. They crossed the Mediterranean and eventually settled in Italy. Simple, neat, logical. There was only one problem. When scientists finally extracted DNA from Etruscan skeletons more than 2,000 years later, the evidence pointed somewhere completely different. Not only was Herodotus probably wrong, almost everyone was, because the people who built Etruscan civilization appear to have been living in Italy the entire time, and somehow that discovery only made the mystery bigger. Because if they weren't immigrants from Anatolia, then where did their language come from? Why was it unlike every surrounding civilization? Why did Roman writers describe them as fundamentally different? And how did a civilization that shaped Rome itself almost vanish from public memory? To answer that, we need to go back nearly 3,000 years, long before the Roman Empire, long before Caesar, long before gladiators, at a time when Rome was little more than a regional settlement struggling to survive. The most advanced civilization in Italy wasn't Roman, it was Etruscan. Around the 8th century BCE, central Italy was dominated by a collection of wealthy city-states: Tarquinia, Cerveteri, Vesii, Volci, Populonia. Names that mean little to most people today. But at the time, these were some of the richest cities in the Western Mediterranean. They had paved roads, drainage systems, monumental temples, busy harbors, trade networks reaching Greece, Carthage, and beyond. The Romans were still learning how to become a city. The Etruscans were already running one, and this is where the mystery begins. Because nobody can agree where these people came from. Ancient historians couldn't agree, modern historians couldn't agree, archaeologists couldn't agree. For centuries, there were three major theories. The first came from Herodotus, the Anatolian theory. The Etruscans migrated from western Turkey. The second came from another ancient historian named Dionysius of Halicarnassus. He completely rejected Herodotus. According to him, the Etruscans were native Italians. Always had been, always would be. The third theory suggested something even stranger, that they represented the surviving remnants of a much older population that existed in Europe before the arrival of Indo-European peoples. For generations, scholars argued endlessly. Books were written, conferences held, careers built. Nobody could prove anything. Then genetics entered the conversation, and suddenly the debate became very dangerous for old theories. In 2021, researchers published one of the most important genetic studies ever conducted on the Etruscans. Scientists extracted DNA from dozens of ancient skeletons buried across central Italy. For the first time, they could directly compare the Etruscans with neighboring populations. The expectation was obvious. If Herodotus was right, traces of Anatolian ancestry should appear. Instead, the results stunned researchers. The Etruscans looked almost identical to their Latin-speaking neighbors. Genetically, they were nearly the same people, same region, same ancestry profile, same deep roots in Italy. The migration from Anatolia? Almost invisible. And that's where things become genuinely weird. Because if the Etruscans were genetically similar to surrounding Italic populations, why weren't they speaking an Italic language? Why weren't they speaking an Indo-European language? Why were they speaking Etruscan? Imagine discovering two neighboring populations that share most of their ancestry but communicate in completely unrelated languages. That's exactly the puzzle. The DNA solved one mystery and immediately created another. In some ways, an even bigger one. Researchers now believe the Etruscans likely descended from the same Bronze Age populations that produced many other peoples of Italy. The genes fit, the archaeology fits, the geography fits, everything fits except the language. The language refuses to cooperate. And before we get there, we need to understand something else. The Etruscans weren't just another ancient people. They were different, noticeably different. Even neighboring civilizations thought so. Greek writers repeatedly described Etruscan customs as unusual. Roman writers often described them with a mixture of admiration and discomfort, and nowhere is that difference more visible than in the city they built for the dead. Because what archaeologists found at Cerveteri doesn't look like a cemetery. It looks like an entire city frozen in time, a city where every resident is dead, and every house is a tomb. The Banditaccia necropolis covers nearly 500 acres. At first glance, it resembles a living settlement. There are streets, intersections, neighborhoods, doorways, rooms, public spaces, except nobody lived there. The entire place was built for the afterlife. And that's where the Etruscans reveal something fascinating about how they saw the world. Most ancient civilizations treated death as a departure. The Etruscans treated it as a continuation. If life continued after death, then the dead would need homes. Furniture, rooms, comfort, companionship. So they built them. Not symbolically, literally. Stone beds, stone chairs, stone tables, stone pillows, entire households carved into rock. More than 26 centuries later, some of those spaces remain astonishingly intact. And when archaeologists first walked through them, many reported the same strange feeling. It didn't feel like exploring ruins. It felt like entering a home whose owners had just stepped outside. And what those homes reveal about Etruscan society will force us to rethink one of the biggest assumptions about the ancient world. And what those homes reveal about Etruscan society will force us to rethink one of the biggest assumptions about the ancient world. Because inside those tombs, archaeologists kept noticing something unexpected. Women, not hidden in the background, not excluded from public life, not identified simply as someone's wife or daughter. Women appeared everywhere, and that immediately caught the attention of Greek and Roman writers. In fact, it bothered them a lot. Ancient authors repeatedly describe Etruscan women with a tone that sounds almost scandalized. They attended banquets, they drank wine, they appeared at public events, they owned property, they were identified by their own names. To modern ears, that doesn't sound particularly shocking. To many neighboring societies, it was. Greek and Roman women were often excluded from public life in ways that Etruscan women apparently were not. And archaeology supports much of what the ancient writers observed. In tomb paintings across Tarquinia, women reclined beside men at banquets, not serving them, not standing behind them, beside them, equal in visibility, equal in status, equal in importance. Some inscriptions even record family lineage through both male and female lines with remarkable precision. The more archaeologists studied Etruscan society, the clearer it became. This civilization operated differently, and if their social structure looked unusual, their language looked impossible. Because despite everything we've discussed so far, the language remains the single greatest Etruscan mystery. More than 13,000 inscriptions have survived. Think about that. 13,000. That isn't a handful of fragments. That is an enormous written record. Most ancient civilizations would be thrilled to leave that much behind, and yet we still cannot fully understand it. Not because the alphabet is unreadable. The alphabet isn't the problem. The letters are known. Many words are known. Basic phrases are known. The problem is deeper. Nobody knows exactly where the language came from. Etruscan is not Indo-European. That alone is extraordinary. Almost every major language surrounding it belonged to the Indo-European family. Latin. Greek. Celtic languages. Germanic languages. Most of Europe, Etruscan did not. It stood alone. A linguistic island surrounded by an ocean of unrelated languages. And despite centuries of study, no universally accepted parent language has ever been identified. Imagine discovering thousands of messages written by a civilization, being able to pronounce many of the words, being able to read the letters, and still not fully understanding what many of the sentences mean. That's the Etruscan problem. And then there is the strangest artifact of all, the Liber Linteus, the Linen Book, the longest surviving Etruscan text ever discovered. Its survival story sounds almost fictional. In the 19th century, a mummy arrived in Croatia. An Egyptian mummy, nothing unusual there. Except when researchers examined the wrapping, they discovered something bizarre. The linen strips surrounding the mummy were covered in Etruscan writing. Somehow an Etruscan text had traveled across the Bois de Mans, Mediterranean, and ended up wrapped around an Egyptian corpse. To this day, nobody knows the entire journey that brought it there. The text itself appears to be a religious calendar, a guide for rituals and ceremonies. Researchers can identify many sections, but even now parts remain uncertain. More than 2,000 years later, the Etruscans are still keeping secrets. And perhaps that is fitting, because mystery seems to follow them everywhere, even in death, even in language, even in religion. Their priests believed the gods communicated constantly with humanity, not through visions, not through prophecy, but through signs hidden in the natural world. Lightning birds, the organs of sacrificed animals. To modern people, that sounds strange. To the Etruscans, it was science. The universe was sending messages. The challenge was learning how to read them. One of the most famous discoveries connected to this belief is known as the liver of Piacenza, a bronze model of a sheep's liver, covered with inscriptions, divided into sections assigned to different deities. Essentially, a map of the cosmos carved onto an organ. It wasn't superstition. It was a complete intellectual system, an attempt to understand how divine forces shaped reality. And here's what makes that remarkable. Rome adopted it, not briefly, not as a curiosity. For centuries, Roman leaders regularly consulted Etruscan specialists known as haruspices, experts trained to interpret divine signs. The practice became so influential that it survived deep into the Roman Empire. Think about that. An empire famous for conquering civilizations was still relying on Etruscan religious experts hundreds of years after Etruscan political independence had vanished. And that pattern appears everywhere. The deeper we look, the more Rome begins to resemble a civilization built on Etruscan foundations. Take gladiators. Most people automatically associate gladiatorial combat with Rome, the Colosseum, the arenas, the spectacles. But Roman writers themselves trace the origins of these events to Etruscan funeral traditions. Competitive games honoring the dead. Rome inherited them, expanded them, commercialized them, and eventually claimed them as its own. The same thing happened with architecture. The same thing happened with religion. The same thing happened with political symbols. The toga. Etruscan. The fasces. Etruscan. Temple design. Etruscan. Urban planning. Etruscs. Strongly influenced by Etruscan models. Even the alphabet you're reading right now carries Etruscan fingerprints. The Etruscans adapted an early Greek alphabet. The Romans adapted the Etruscan version. And from that chain of transmission emerged Latin script, which spread across Europe, then across much of the world. Every email, every website, every text message, every book written in the Latin alphabet, All of it traces part of its ancestry through Etruria. And suddenly, the story changes. Because the Etruscans stop looking like a forgotten civilization, they start looking like a civilization hidden in plain sight, which brings us to the final irony. People often ask what happened to the Etruscans. The answer sounds simple. Rome conquered them. But that's not really what happened. Conquest suggests a sudden ending. History rarely works that way. The Etruscans weren't erased overnight. They were absorbed, city by city, generation by generation, marriage by marriage, alliance by alliance. Latin slowly replaced Etruscan. Roman institutions replaced Etruscan institutions. Roman citizenship expanded, political independence disappeared, but cultural influence remained. The Romans inherited so much from the Etruscans that separating the two becomes almost impossible. And that's why the DNA evidence feels so important, because it forces us to rethink the entire story. For centuries, historians searched for some distant homeland, some dramatic migration, some foreign origin. The genetic evidence suggests something much stranger. The Etruscans may have been local all along. Their ancestors lived in Italy. Their cities rose in Italy. Their civilization flourished in Italy. Yet they created a culture unlike anything around them, a language that still resists explanation, a society that treated women differently, a religion that shaped Rome, a civilization that helped build the foundations of the Western world, and then quietly disappeared into the civilization that came after it. Or maybe disappeared is the wrong word, because every time you write a sentence, every time you see a Roman temple, every time you hear about gladiators, every time you encounter the symbols of Roman power, you're looking at part of their legacy. The Etruscans didn't vanish, they became invisible. And sometimes that's the most complete victory a civilization can achieve. You stop seeing it because it's everywhere.